Hi honey pies. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about shadow work. I do have a video already about getting started with shadow work, and a couple more. I think I made one last summer called Shadow Work in the Sunshine or the Summertime or something. So if you've been watching me for any length of time, you already know I'm a huge proponent of the process of shadow work. And if you watch the Getting Started with Shadow Work video, if you're not entirely sure what shadow work is, if you're looking to find a definition for it, which is quite comprehensible, then you can watch that video and it will give you some insight. So really what we're looking for with shadow work is we're looking to find the disowned parts of ourselves, and we're looking to integrate them. And some reasons why you might disown certain parts of yourself, certain attributes, certain things that you think, certain things that you want to do, ambitions that you have, sub-personalities as they're called in psychology, the parts of you that do reflect the whole and are part of the whole, but which you've chosen to kind of shut away. One of the main reasons is conditioning from your primary caregivers in your formative years, your parental figures or role models in your adolescence, society at large, what you think society expects of you, the zeitgeist that you live in or lived in when you were younger with your societal makeup, and how you felt that reflected on you and reflected on your sense of yourself and what you wanted to do. Trauma would be a good reason to disown parts of yourself. The shamans, various groups of shamans, use something called soul retrieval or some variation on soul retrieval, which is a very powerful way of trying to kind of career through the psyche towards that fragmented shard of the self which broke off during trauma. And the reason it broke off is primarily for self-protection, for self-preservation. For example, you hear about when terrible things happen to people, they say that it was almost like being out of body for that moment. And this is when the primal brain kicks in, and it's really to stop fear, it's to stop panic, it's part of the fight or flight thing that we have within us, whereby if something really traumatic is happening to us and a situation is unfolding which is actually too much for the whole of the psyche to bear, you will kind of cut off your emotional responses in favour of the brain being allowed to decide, how do we survive, how do we get through this, what is the next step. And as a result of that, the part of the psyche which is actually damaged by the trauma, or the part of the psyche that in some sense just won't be the same afterwards, kind of fragments away. And the whole point of soul retrieval, and also to an extent the whole point of shadow work, if you're doing shadow work to kind of reintegrate your entire personality, your entire self after trauma, is to actually reconnect that part of the psyche, to actually embrace it, to actually acknowledge it as part of who you are. A lot of people disown parts of themselves as a coping strategy. Again, this could be to do with the primary caregivers in your life and what they expect of you. It could be to do with trying to avoid systematic abuse, learning and understanding what your abuser does and does not want from you, what your abuser will and will not accept, and as a result of that you kind of shape your personality in accordance with your abuser's will so that you don't end up coming to more harm. It's also a coping strategy for dealing with being with different groups of people. Compartmentalisation is a huge problem for many people who actually actively wish to go into shadow work, and it's something that I've noticed more and more, that it's very difficult actually for people to recognise the fact that they have different versions of themselves for different groups of people, or they maintain different versions of themselves, very tightly woven and very distinctly defined personas depending on who they're with and what they're doing and what's expected of them. And to a small extent, compartmentalisation can be useful. For example, if we think about the kind of compartmentalisation which is actually healthy, we're thinking about maybe acting appropriately in terms of who you're around. For example, maybe you swear, and maybe around your grandparents you won't swear. Or maybe you behave in a very outgoing and kind of like loud and gratuitous manner, and maybe you wouldn't behave that way, at church with your family. Whatever it is. This is reasonable degree of compartmentalisation which can be understood and which doesn't actually harm or affect the psyche in any wider sense. You understand why you're doing it and it's conscious. But when compartmentalisation becomes incredibly damaging and incredibly kind of soul-sucking, is when you don't even realise that you're morphing into different versions of yourself in order to seek validation from the people you're with, or in order to feel more whole or more normal in the different environments that you have to go into, and you actually take no core sense of self with you. And this is enslaving. It's incredibly intense to have to do that each and every day. And at the point where you recognise you're compartmentalising and you have that aha moment, that might be a time when shadow work will come into your life in a very significant way, trying to find the root causes for that compartmentalisation and so on. God, I am rambling. But it's all relevant. And, you know, being rejected by others on the basis of one of your key attributes, one of your personality traits, whatever it is. If you found that you were rejected by a partner, or you were rejected by a friend, if you find that you were rejected by your parents for consistently kind of bringing that attribute out, or bringing that kind of core personality segment out, you might do away with it in order to avoid that rejection and in order to feel like you're part of the tribe. One of the reasons that I think shadow work is so important, and one of the reasons that I offer shadow work readings and I try and speak about shadow work as much as possible, is because I think shadow work is an act of compassion that's bestowed upon the self. I think that provided the motivations are correct and the intentions are pure and you understand why you're going into it, it's actually a very friendly thing to do for yourself, to try and integrate the different parts of your personality, to do so without judgment, and to understand that it's okay to be flawed, and it's okay to be multifaceted, and it's okay to have all of these different sides to you which make you so, you know, multi-dimensional, I suppose. And so I think it's a great act of compassion. I think many people come to shadow work after realising that for far too long they've been tying themselves up in knots, trying to get it right, trying to be all things to all people, not knowing who they are at their core, feeling that there are certain things deep down inside them that they would like to be able to bring out into the light, but they don't feel entitled, or they feel scared of the consequences of doing that. And it actually comes from a point of radical acceptance, which is born out of sincere frustration, as people realise, you know, I'm not being everything that I really am, and you know, there are these parts of me that are buried deep down that I'm uncomfortable with or ashamed of, and that wasn't my choice, or I no longer want it to be my choice, kind of thing. And then really the exploration can go as deep as you want it to go, and for some people it's a life's work, and for some people it is an incredibly deep exploration, and it does go to some very, very interesting and profound places. I really believe that if you are actively doing shadow work, then you are much more able to be compassionate towards other people. You will judge with less immediacy. You will judge with more empathy in mind, so basically you'll judge less. And you'll wait to receive all of the facts, and you will understand the consequences of your judgments upon others too. Because I think a lot of people don't judge anybody in life as harshly as they judge themselves. And when you engage with shadow work, it's really your commitment to yourself to stop judging so harshly, to bring out whatever is in the darkness to the light, and actually to look at it head on, full on, and appreciate it for what it is. Appreciate it as your many selves integrated into one whole. And when you're doing that actively, it's difficult to judge other people, it's difficult to reject other people out of hand without understanding their history and their personal story. Because of course, if you're doing that in your own life, then it will constantly occur to you that other people must be struggling with it in their lives, and other people have reasons why they've come to the place in their life that they are now, and so on. So it really just makes you more aware, and it just makes you more compassionate, it makes you more open to the reality that other people are as multifaceted as you are, and that creates a lot of calm and a lot of release in people's lives when they come to that stage where they can really think that and know that. And you know, I think that it's a big part of shadow work, is focusing on how your experiences enable you to interact with other people, or stunt you from interacting with other people. And shadow work is like self-love, a daily practice. Like, you know, a lot of people will say that they're going through a bout of shadow work. I say that. I actually plan sometimes to do a month of intensive shadow work. You know, you'll actually get the book out and you'll do it every day, and it will become kind of a ritual, and you will kind of encourage yourself to do it whether you want to or not. It will be kind of something that you dedicate yourself to. It will be a course of work, of inner work that you know will bring you to deeper moments of illumination. But really, shadow work is something that you do every day too. You bring it into each situation with you, and I think really it's those intensive bouts of shadow work that especially witches tend to do, and I'll talk about why they do that in a while. But I think it's those intensive bouts of committed shadow work where we actually show up for ourselves and do the work every day, even when we'd rather do anything but shadow work, even when we want to throw the book out the window. It's those intensive periods which actually lead to being able to do shadow work every day and bring it into every situation and use it to understand every connection in your life. I think shadow work is also a form of treasure hunting, because a lot of stuff deep down there in the shadow, it's not actually negative. It shouldn't actually be viewed as bad. It shouldn't be looked upon with a shameful emotional response. For example, some people have ambition in their shadow because they were kind of conditioned to believe that, you know, ambition is linked with pride and arrogance, and it's not a very attractive trait or whatever. And really, ambition, when it's honed correctly and when you embrace it and when you see the beauty in it, is wonderful. I could give many examples of things that are actually in the shadow self due to conditioning that really shouldn't be in there, and really if they're integrated then they won't hold the control, they won't hold the power anymore. I think the only thing that makes an attribute toxic in a sense is how hard we try to repress it, how far we try and push it down. That's what gives it its power. Really what you're doing when you take stuff out of the shadow that you consider to be shameful is you are demoting it. You are telling it that you have dominion over it, that it's part of you. It's not something that you are running from. It's not a monster that you need to hide from. It's part of you, and therefore you have ultimate control over the way you react to it and the way you place it into your life. So I think that's really part of it as well. It's stripping these big scary things of their control and realising that, you know, they are not separate entities on their own to be locked into boxes and for us to hope they never come out. They are part of us, and we get to choose how to respond and how we put those things into our lives. So it's really about reframing. It's about reframing sometimes the things that you see as shameful, because really if they are adopted in the right way and encouraged and honed in the right way, they're not shameful in any sense. They're actually wonderful. They actually help you to be more expansive and more authentic and whatnot. But because we have that original framework of shame, we don't realise just how much treasure can be found in the shadow and how much further we could get in our lives if we stopped placing those attributes into the shadow. Shadow work is really a form of healing. It's about finding the root causes for the negative cycles. You know, sometimes there's a lot of slapping a band-aid on it, as they say in the US. Slapping a plaster on it doesn't have the same ring. But yeah, we slap a band-aid on it. We try and deal with a negative cycle by putting in these proactive, practical, pragmatic things, or, right, I'll have this daily routine, or I'll change this up. But there comes a point when that cycle has continued indefinitely where we need to actually look at why this cycle occurred in the first place and why it's so deeply ingrained. And that's shadow work, you know, to delve into your personal history and to find that evidence for why things are happening as they are. So that's very important. And when we do shadow work, we can reclaim our projections too. This is very important work. This is one aspect of shadow work that I think most people feel very appreciative for and grateful for, and also that a lot of people find very difficult. When we deny any attributes within ourselves that we consider to be unacceptable by ascribing them to other people or groups of people or concepts, and, you know, looking at those things and saying, oh, you know, those things are that, when in reality it's us ourselves that have that attribute or have that perceived flaw within, that projecting can go to very dark places. And it's certainly advisable to use shadow work to break our projections, to reclaim them, and to understand where the genesis of some of those things are within us. And, you know, projection is a term that's thrown around quite a lot when people get into disagreements and when people start slinging mud. And, you know, it's not always relevant, and it's not always relevant to, you know, insist that somebody may need to do some shadow work if they disagree with somebody. In essence, I think sometimes we can muddy the water with regard to what shadow work and projection actually mean, and particularly with regard to how one can actually help to ease the other. And really, in the long run, only an individual can decide whether or not it's time for them to do some shadow work. But really, quite often, when people lash out, when people character assassinate, when people use extreme statements, for example, if somebody was to say, I'm not happy with the fact that this person did that, that might not necessarily be a projection, it might not need shadow work. But when people say, I don't like that kind of person, this person is this kind of person, that to me is a sign that shadow work may be necessary, that projection is occurring. And, you know, every single person will find their own path towards their projections and being able to reclaim their projections. But it really is wonderful work, and it is very humbling. and it can make you realise just how much power you have over yourself. It can help, you know, with the way we judge, with the way we interact with other people. It can help us to look at our long-standing negative patterns from a much deeper and more profound perspective. It can help us with our bad memories. It can help us with our inability to deal with childhood, and it can help us to engage in better witchcraft. You know, many witches do shadow work, dedicated shadow work. They talk about the value of shadow work, and I remember quite a long time ago I was watching a video, I think it was by Miss Fiendish Bat, I think I've got that right, and she was saying that there are two distinct kinds of shadow work: the psychological aspect, which was developed by Jung, and then, you know, the mystical aspect, which witches use to become a clear vessel. And I found that quite interesting, actually, and I would say that I agree and disagree. I understand that there's a difference with regard to motivation, potentially, but I do think that witches work predominantly with Jung's outline, with his framework anyway, but, you know, we might do it for slightly different reasons. We might put more of a mystical spin on it sometimes, and that is because we work with energy. That's because we practice magic. That is because we, you know, we use our will, we direct our energy, we manifest, and we, you know, whatever we do in the circle, when we're raising energy, when we're directing it, whatever kind of magic we use, we wish to be a completely clear channel for that. We wish to be as focused as possible, as dedicated as possible, as present as possible, as powerful as we can possibly be, as empowered as we can possibly be, and we want to make sure that our intentions are pure and that our perspectives are pure. And, you know, sometimes when we work far too much from our own perspective, and our perspective is completely skewed, then the energy that we put out is going to be confused, or it's going to be diffuse, or it's, you know, it's not going to have the same punch to it. We want to practice ritual which is really empowered and which is really life-changing, and which connects us to source and source perspective and that sense of oneness and all of the power that can be drawn from that and given to that in return. And shadow work helps us to do that, helps us to clean out. It's cleaning the shit out, scraping the insides out, making it all nice and new again, in a sense. No, you know, you will never be disconnected from your personal history, but if you're allowing your personal history to colour everything, or your judgments to colour everything, or your hatred and your resentment, or whatever it is, to colour everything, then yes, you know, magic is going to be much more difficult to do. Your intent is going to be much more difficult to grasp. So, you know, there is that sense of needing to be a clear channel, needing to clear everything out, and I think it's almost a type of spiritual spring cleaning, or kind of maintaining a good house from which to actually send your intent out, kind of thing. I think that the motivations for shadow work are really important, and if you watch my Getting Started with Shadow Work video, I do talk about at some point motivations that can kind of be less than compassionate towards the self. So it's important to know why you're starting, and I give exercises in that video as well to help you get started if you've not done it before. But essentially you can begin by looking at the difficulties in your life right now and asking yourself, how am I accountable and what can I change? And, you know, if your answers are, I'm not accountable and there's nothing I can change, then I would say you're not ready. You know, that would be a simplistic but very useful doorway for people who are seeking to go into it for the first time or going into it again. So finally, I just wanted to say that I do offer shadow work readings on my Etsy shop for those who might be struggling to know where to get started, or would like to use techniques which have been honed over time by different analysts, and you know, want to use the framework that was set up by Jung. It's certainly not kind of information heavy, but what I do is I use the cards to actually focus on key aspects of the client's shadow that may need attention, and then offer very accessible exercises for the client to actually go on into long-term shadow work themselves. And I offer shadow work reading number 1 and 2. It's split into 2 parts. The first part is much more accessible, and the exercises are kind of broader in scope and easier to implement on a daily basis. And then the second part is more to do with different archetypes that you might need to connect with. I use an interesting 4 archetype framework by Jung, and I go into kind of deeper explorations, exercises which might take a little bit more deep consideration, or bring kind of results into play over a longer period of time, so it's more dedicated, and that's why I've split it up. Many people have chosen only to do part 1 and have stuck with those exercises. I know one client who's stuck with those same exercises in reading 1 for 18 months, and said that it's been like phenomenal how much she's been able to progress just using those key exercises and the tarot cards that were kind of related to her specific shadows for focus, you know, because the shadowscape is a great big wide place, and really what it's about is it's about understanding that the shadowscape itself is inhabited by many shadows. So when we're doing shadow work, we're talking about traversing the terrain of the shadowscape, rather than looking at everything as one vast shadow. It's not, and it could never be, shadow work could never be done in any significant or meaningful sense if we saw it like that. We have to see the fact that the shadowscape is inhabited by many shadows, and you start with one, and a lot of the time you'll find they're linked. A lot of the time you'll find some are more conscious in your mind, some are less conscious in your mind, some are more accessible to work with, some are less accessible to work with, some are more painful, some aren't so painful, some are more relevant now, you know, some you've done the work with without even knowing it, and they all tie together into one big shadowscape, which is the terrain. But focusing on individual shadows and trying to find those little points where it would be valuable to start, that's really what the shadow work reading is all about. It's about kind of zooming in on the best shadows to start with and the best techniques to actually go forward with that. So if you would like a shadow work reading, I will link below. I also do something called energetic shadow mapping, which is a technique that I have developed over quite a long time, and only started to offer it at some point last year after practicing it and kind of honing the technique for a very long time. And this is more of a shamanic map of your shadow terrain, and you know, it works by me actually venturing into your field, your energetic field, and bringing back some kind of snapshot of what I received while I was there. And it's quite a long and complex process, not for the client but for me. There's a lot of writing involved, and I have to actually develop the map using objects and cards and crystals and things to show the visual representation of what I actually experience and what I think from now the main points of reference should be for shadow work in the long term. So that is also something that I offer, but I am kind of strict with who is accepted for it, in terms of the fact that they must have done some active shadow work of some kind before. We need to have a dialogue first. I need to understand really what their motivations are to ensure that they're coming at it from the right place, because some of the things that come back from a shamanic exploration such as that can be quite challenging, and you know, the kind of shadow work that it kind of sends you off into is very profound, and you know, can be quite game changing. So I do insist on having a dialogue, and it does say on the purchase option, please don't purchase this until we've had a discussion and I can understand what your needs are and whether or not it's the right time to work together, etc. So yeah, that's another thing that I do offer, and I'll link that below if you wanted to check out the description of it. And this is all for now on shadow work. Keep doing it, guys. If you have any questions, please leave them below. Much love, blessed be.